Hey, how you doing?
Hi, Andre. I'm good.
Hey, Andy. Hey, I want to say thanks to everybody for tuning in, and we're very excited to finally be filming our first few episodes of the Matcha Lover's Guide to the Galaxy. It seems like the show's been a long time in the making. When we started talking about the content and the structure of putting the podcast together, it was long before this COVID-19 pandemic that we find ourselves in the middle of right now. Given the fact that we are in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic, I thought it would be best maybe to do the first few episodes to talk about COVID-19 just specifically. As I was preparing for the podcast, I started to research COVID-19 and pandemics and plagues in general, and it was pretty eye-opening. Seems like historically we've had a number of pretty bad plagues, a number of pretty bad pandemics, and I thought it would be good to kind of maybe go back in history a bit to talk a little bit about just pandemics in general. Given that, I think for folks that who aren't aware of what a pandemic is, or just in general what plagues are, maybe you could talk a little bit about pandemics and plagues before we get started on COVID-19.
Well, a pandemic is a disease that breaks out in epidemic form that is affecting lots of people in more than one place in the world. So when an epidemic disease begins to occur in a number of different countries or regions, it's called a pandemic. The word plague has both a general and a specific meaning. I mean, in general, it means any kind of visitation by something really harmful. You can talk about a plague of locusts, for example, or an army, attacking army being a plague, or an infectious disease. But the specific reference is to a bacterial disease caused by a specific organism, Yersinia pestis, and it occurs in three forms. The most common is bubonic plague, which was called the Black Death, that great pandemic in Europe in the 1300s, but has broken out several times since. There's also a pneumonic form, which is direct person-to-person spread from aerosolized droplets, and there's a septicemic form in the blood. And nobody really knows why that disease was so horrible in the Middle Ages. And since then, except for a few outbreaks, I mean, there have been some recent ones in China in the early 1900s. There have been cases in San Francisco. But since then, they're very sporadic cases. In the U.S., they mainly occur now on the Navajo reservation, interestingly enough, and it's like a few isolated cases. But I guess there's always a potential for that to occur again. It was a almost universally fatal disease. There are now antibiotic treatments for it if given in time.
So as far as the pandemic's concerned, like when they declare an official pandemic, is it based off of the amount of people that become infected?
Yeah, it's the numbers of people infected and where they are. That is, like it's in widely separated regions.
So if we go back historically, it seems that even before the Black Plague, there were several cases of plagues and really bad things
Well,
that took place.
probably many, and in a lot of cases, we don't really know what they were. We hypothesize that some of the pandemics that happened in ancient times were influenza, but we don't really know that for sure. We just have the descriptions of some writers. In more recent times, it's much better documented. There was a Russian flu pandemic in the 1890s. There was the very famous 1911 flu that's mistakenly called the Spanish flu.
Right.
That's much worse than what we're seeing now with COVID-19. And there also have been devastating pandemics of infectious syphilis. Shortly after the discovery of the New World, there have been pandemics of measles and smallpox. And some of these have really had huge impacts on populations, that they've killed a significant percentage of human populations.
Yeah, so before we go into COVID-19 specifically, let's go back a little bit. I want to talk about, the Spanish flu and particularly, as it relates to possible, misinformation.
Sure.
The name obviously is one of the.
Yeah, I think it's better called the H1N1 flu of
Okay.
1918.
Right.
And poor Spain got stuck with that name. That it did not originate in Spain. There are various theories as to where it came from. The leading one is that it originated in Kansas. and that the first documented case was in a soldier in an army barracks in Kansas, and it may have gotten there from a nearby poultry farm. Influenza, the natural reservoirs are in birds, especially in ducks and waterfowl, but they can get into domestic poultry as well, and then often have pigs as an intermediate host and get into humans. But that was a distinctive form. The influenza virus mutates very frequently, and this is why it's difficult to develop vaccines for it. And immunity to one type doesn't give you immunity to others. But that one was a particularly virulent type that had a much higher mortality rate than seasonal flu, and also selectively killed young people, which is not typical of influenza. But the estimates are that killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people around the world. We don't really know because in many areas of the world, like the Amazon and in the Arctic, there really are no records. But we know that some Inuit communities were almost completely wiped out.
That's a staggering number of
Yeah.
people, 50 to 100 million people.
Yeah, it
It's
makes
hard to
this
fathom.
present situation look, rather tame. That's probably one of the worst pandemics in history. And, experts on infectious diseases have been telling us really for some time that we're due for a really bad pandemic. And frankly, I don't think the COVID-19 is the big one. I think
not the
that
big one.
I think it's very likely that we'll see something that's much worse in terms of infectivity and virulence. But there's I think a real cautionary tale with COVID-19 because we had plenty of time to see this coming. As I say, experts were warning about this happening for years. There have been these popular films like Outbreak that have gotten, really put the notion out there of what could happen. We saw this developing in China in December. We had plenty of time to get rid of it and ready for it. And I think there's just no excuse for the U.S. being as unprepared as it was.
So what makes you think like we could have done better? And then not only on top of that, but there must be some early warning systems that either people did not pick up on or that it was just flat out ignored.
Well, it appears that this disease entered the U.S. on the East Coast and was brought in by people from Europe. I think all the concern was about people coming in the other way from Asia. So we didn't take any precautions about that. We did not have testing capacity to identify people that were infected. And I think that put us at a tremendous disadvantage. I think if social distancing and quarantine measures had been put effect early enough, probably thousands of people who died would not have died.
That brings up a question. I mean, obviously this isn't the first time that we've had, a pandemic of this nature. We've had a number of them in the past, 200 years. So given that we've, supposedly learned so many things of how they happened, how they spread, it's like, why do you think we didn't have a better response as a country than what we had?
Well, I'm not going to go into the politics of
Okay.
it, but I think our leadership was just really failed us here, by not taking it seriously, by not, from the very first moment getting ready, by having the testing equipment, having the personal protective gear in necessary quantities. We just blew it.
So as far as, it seems like that there's some conversation right now, about kind of where COVID-19 originated. And, and also to, having the WHO, kind of be the governing body to protect us for these types of situations. Like, do you feel like they gave the appropriate response in a timely manner, or?
I think historically the WHO has been very reliable. It may have been slow to respond to some of the serious outbreaks and pandemics of the past, but I think in general it's been good. We don't really know exactly how this originated, but the best guess is that it came from a bat because that's where many of these viral diseases come from, and it's likely that somewhere in Guangdong province that a bat gave it to a person. That person may have brought it to the wet market in Wuhan. I'm not sure it originated in the wet market. I don't think it came from that virology lab, but I don't know. But I think it was bat to human transmission, and then conditions favored it. In the 1918 pandemic, this was at the end of World War One, and certainly the chaos of the war and crowding and troop movements and all those conditions favored the spread of the virus, and that may have contributed to the scale of the outbreak. By the way, also one thing you think about in 1918, we didn't know what viruses were. I mean, nobody knew about that. We knew that this was something infectious that could not be identified as a bacterium. It was smaller than a bacterium, but nobody knew about viruses, and really no one knew how they spread. And one of the things that I've read is that, up to that time, it was a cultural accepted thing to spit in public. Especially for men, and all saloons had spittoons. I don't know if you've ever seen any of these, but I've seen brass ones that were on the floor, and you spit into them, and people spit on the streets. And one thing that happened as a result of that pandemic is that became an unacceptable cultural practice, and probably helped curb some of the spread of the infection. We're at an advantage now, and we have better ideas of how these things are spread. But as you know, there's still a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, as I was preparing for, the podcast, again, I was researching historic pandemics and plagues and those types of things. And I think that, a lot of our listeners probably won't know a lot about the difference between a virus or a bacteria, and confuse influenza with bubonic plague and those kinds of things. Can you give us a little bit of a lesson in the differences between viruses and bacterias? And
well, bacteria are living cellular organisms on a certain size scale, much bigger than viruses, and they're alive and they reproduce in the ways that living things do. Viruses, it's not clear whether they're living or not living. I mean, they're just little packets of genetic material enclosed by protein, and they can't reproduce unless they get within a living cell. There are viruses that attack bacteria or live within bacteria. And a big difference is that we have effective treatments for many bacterial diseases, especially antibiotics. We, in general, do not have good antiviral drugs. We have a few, but with most viral infections, there's not much we can do about them.